All right, we are wrapping up our reproductive system lectures in this video, talking about how the two different reproductive systems develop, which is actually one of my favorite subtopics of this chapter. I find it very, very fascinating. So we're not going to focus a whole lot on actual human development. So this process of how we go from that fertilization to an actual baby, that is kind of a different topic than what we're looking at here in anatomy. But there's some cool resources out there. If you are interested in that, you can always let me know if you would like some additional resources. I'm happy to send those to you. But really briefly, just to kind of set the stage for the actual development of the reproductive system organs, we got to go from a zygote to a blastocyst. So fertilization occurs when the chromosomes from sperm and egg cells combine together, and at that point it is now considered a zygote. So this is a single cell, a fertilized egg cell. The zygote then divides to 2 cells, and then 4, and then 8, so on and so forth, until we reach 16 cells, which is called a morula. This is a solid ball of 16 cells. And then these cells will continue dividing through mitosis until we reach a blastocyst stage, which is a hollow ball of cells. This is what implants into the endometrium. So the rest of these steps are happening in the uterine tubes. So that is where fertilization should occur. Ectopic pregnancies happen when this implants in the uterine tubes. That is very dangerous. It is not sustainable. That fertilized egg cannot be re-implanted anywhere. Once it implants, it's fusing to that tissue. So trying to remove it and put it somewhere else, like once you remove it, it's dead. So that is not possible. But generally speaking, this will transition down that uterine tube, and then the blastocyst will implant in the endometrium layer of the uterus. Then we get into that early stage of development where we are starting to look at very, very, very early development of various tissues in the body, including the reproductive tissues. So, female anatomy, so the anatomy of somebody who has 2 X chromosomes and would have ovaries and a uterus and a vagina, this is called the default pathway, is one way of looking at it, or the fundamental sex is what it's sometimes referred to as. There's some debate as to how to phrase this, but we're going to talk about that a little bit. So if a Y chromosome is present, we are going to see what is called the SRY gene. And this gene, the SRY gene, is only present on the Y chromosome. So it is not present on the X chromosomes. So if somebody does not have a Y chromosome, they do not have this gene at all. And this gene is the key to signaling this tissue to differentiate into testes, which will produce testosterone, which will signal the rest of the organs for that particular system to develop. All right, so the reason this female anatomy is considered to be the default pathway or the fundamental sex is because as an embryo and fetus, the reproductive structures sit as what are called bipotential tissues. So bi means 2, potential, I think it's pretty self-explanatory. So this is tissue that can develop in 2 different pathways. So in the embryo, this is tissue that can develop into either the male or female gonads, depending on that presence or absence of the Y chromosome and therefore SRY gene. So in an embryo, there are 2 very rudimentary duct systems. So those duct systems are either going to be the uterine tubes, uterus and vagina, or it's going to be the epididymis, vas deferens, and then into the accessory glands and urethra. So the Mullerian duct system is what will develop into that female anatomy of having the ovaries, uterus, and vagina in the absence of that Y chromosome or non-functional SRY gene. I'll talk more about that in a moment. And then the other duct system is called the Wolffian duct, which will develop into the testes, prostate gland, seminal glands, and penis in the presence of a Y chromosome with a functional SRY gene on it. So whether or not that Y chromosome is present with a functional SRY gene, if it's not, then this Wolffian duct system more or less shrinks down. It's not going to develop, and the Mullerian duct system will, and vice versa in the presence of that Y chromosome with a functional SRY gene on it. So kind of moving on to this image, so a little bit of visual aid. So here's our bipotential tissue. So this tissue is sexually indifferent, so it's undifferentiated. So these are the gonad tissues. And then here in green is going to be our Wolffian duct system. And then in this more yellowish color or mustard color, it's very subtle, that's our Mullerian duct system. And so again, that SRY gene, as long as it is functioning properly, can signal that Mullerian duct system to kind of shrink down, and then we will get the testes, epididymis, vas deferens, so on and so forth. And without it, then we will get ovaries, and then the oviducts or uterine tubes, and the uterus and vagina itself. So what can happen is any mutations in some of these genes with the X and Y chromosomes can lead to intersex people. Genes on those chromosomes that are not functioning properly can also lead to that, as well as some other scenarios. So I heard recently about an individual who is biologically male, so they have an X and a Y chromosome, but their SRY gene was not functional. It did not activate properly, and so they did not develop testes or produce testosterone. And so the anatomy that they ended up developing is going to look like the female reproductive system with uterine tubes and a uterus and stuff like that. But the actual chromosome makeup is X and a Y gene. But the SRY gene did not activate correctly, so it did not signal for the testes to start producing testosterone, which will signal the rest of those structures to develop. So their testes are actually still located up in the abdomen. They have to get them scanned regularly to make sure that they are not developing cancer or anything like that. There's not any issues with them. But this individual looks from the outside to be female, where they are actually biologically male. And I believe they go by they, them pronouns. If I remember correctly, I would have to double check on that, because that's what feels right to them. So that's kind of getting more into gender rather than biological sex. But like I mentioned at the beginning of this lecture series, there is a lot of variation naturally within the population as to how these different things happen. So that's why on this slide I was mentioning that SRY gene is really, really key, because even if that Y chromosome is present, if the SRY gene isn't functioning properly, then you are still not going to have that testosterone production at the levels that are required to trigger the development of the actual testes, for them to descend into the scrotum, for the penis to develop, for the vas deferens to develop, and all of those different things. So those individuals can be biologically male, but appear from the outside to be female. All right, and then there's a lot of other variation again that can trigger different setups and stuff. So there is a gentleman in Italy that went his entire life having a uterus without knowing it, didn't find that out until his 70s or 80s when he had surgery, I believe on the prostate gland, and they informed him that he had a uterus and he didn't know, but everything else for that anatomy developed properly, had full testosterone production, did not have infertility issues, had children and everything. So there was no reason for them to go in and find out that they had a uterus earlier on in life. But I've always found this sexual differentiation super fascinating, that this one single gene and whether or not it is functional can determine what tissue these duct systems end up developing into and what organs result from it. All right. So that is that early embryonic development. So this will further develop as the embryo and fetus grows into the full structures that we see at birth. But again, those structures are largely going to remain unchanged until puberty starts. So very similar events are going to occur in both sexes at puberty. So the hypothalamus will start secreting that gonadotropin-releasing hormone, which will trigger the pituitary gland to produce luteinizing hormone and follicle-stimulating hormone, which will start getting the gonads producing their respective gametes and hormones. So that gonadotropin-releasing hormone starts at puberty in really high levels. We get LH and FSH going to the testes and ovaries, depending on that individual's anatomy. We'll get that testosterone production, estrogen and progesterones, and those will start the development of what are called secondary sex characteristics. So these are what we actually see in individuals. So these are going to be a lot more obvious and visual without needing to know what somebody's actual genitalia is, internal or external. So for people who are going to have that Y chromosome present with a functional SRY gene, that testosterone is going to cause an increase in the size of the larynx, which will help with the voice getting deeper. There's going to be more muscle development, more growth of facial, axillary, and pubic hair, and general body hair in general for a lot of people. Growth spurts, so increased bone size and muscle development, will start usually between ages 11 and 13. Whereas for people who are going to have more of that estrogen and progesterone production, there will be an increased deposition of fat, especially in the breast tissue and hips. So that breast development, as well as that mons pubis. That's pretty important. So the pelvic bones, again, are going to widen a bit for childbirth. This will also have some axillary and pubic hair growth, actually due to testosterone production again, just not, again, as at high levels as somebody who's going to have testes. Growth spurts usually start between ages 9 and 11 for these individuals, so a little bit earlier on. And these ages actually are getting lower and lower. The thought is that this has a lot to do with our increased availability of nutrients and just calories in general, as well as the presence of probably a lot of chemicals that are impacting the endocrine system as a whole. So there are a lot of chemicals that we have found that are going to impact the endocrine system, so not just reproductive hormones, but all of them. Some of these chemicals have been banned from the market. Triclosan is one that was banned relatively recently in the grand scheme of things. It was used as an antibacterial agent. They would infuse it into yoga mats and other workout equipment. It was found in antibacterial hand soaps, but it was found to be a big endocrine system disruptor, so it was messing with a lot of hormones. But other things like that could be triggering the start of puberty earlier and earlier in life. But some of it is nutrient availability and just overall calorie availability, because 100 years ago, puberty largely didn't start until 16, 17, 18, because a lot of those people had a harder time getting the nutrients that they needed to actually start this development, because the body is going to recognize that if it does not have the resources necessary to start these processes, start puberty, and in the case of people who have a uterus and can support a fetus and a baby, you need those resources available. So if they're not there, there's no point in going through all of this work, because this is not necessary for an individual's survival. It is necessary for the survival of a species as a whole, but not a particular individual. So we just got off a little bit on human development and evolution there, but these are our secondary sex characteristics that start. It does seem to be getting earlier and earlier, which is of concern to a lot of people, but we're not really sure the root cause and what to do about it at this point in time. So there's a lot more research needed into that particular area. And that wraps things up for the reproductive system and this week's lecture videos.